The date was December 16, 1944, and the Ardennes forest was the setting. For the German soldiers of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, this day was meant to be a triumph. They were the vanguard of Hitler's last desperate gambit to turn the tide of the war, a devastating surprise attack that had shattered the tranquil American lines. The air, heavy with fog and the scent of pine, buzzed with the energy of the offensive. These men had endured the Eastern Front, staring down the Red Army, and they were intimately familiar with the rhythms of combat. The whistle of incoming artillery, the thud of impact, the distinct shape of a shell crater provided potential cover. Despite the horrific and ruthless nature of warfare, certain protocols were still observed. However, this morning, those established norms were collapsing. The American artillery responded to the assault, but something was amiss. The high-pitched wail of the projectiles was familiar, yet the outcome was not. There were no impacts, no bursts of frozen soil and fractured rock. Instead, the shells simply vanished mid-flight, replaced by a piercing, deafening crack directly above. Then came a downpour, an eerily uniform, impossibly dense barrage of shrapnel that swept through the forest with hurricane-like force. Whether in a foxhole or not, it made no difference. Concealed behind an ancient oak, or crouched in a shallow trench, the soldiers braced themselves. Deadly steel rained down, piercing uniforms and flesh with merciless indifference. Panic gripped the men. This was no ordinary artillery barrage. It was as if each shell possessed an uncanny awareness, selecting the perfect moment to detonate. Seasoned veterans, masters of survival by clinging to the earth, were now being torn apart in the very shelters they had dug. Entire squads, marching in perfect formation moments earlier, now lay as crimson blots on the snow. They confronted an adversary who had, it seemed, weaponized the very heavens above. The German troops found themselves confronting an unfamiliar and devastating force on the battlefield. Unbeknownst to them, they had become unwitting test subjects for a groundbreaking secret weapon of World War II, the proximity fuse. This revolutionary device, whose development was cloaked in secrecy akin to the Manhattan Project, was about to make its debut on the front lines. At that very moment, the individual responsible for unleashing this technological marvel was poised to change the course of the war. The proximity fuse represented a new and perplexing form of destruction. How could an explosive shell detonate with such precision, maximizing the damage inflicted? The German soldiers had no way of comprehending the science behind this game-changing innovation. Yet, they were about to experience its devastating effects firsthand. Colonel Oscar Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group witnessed the American 38th Cavalry Squadron's line crumbling under the German onslaught near Manchow. His conventional artillery proved ineffective in halting their advance. Axelson faced a critical decision: adhere to his orders from the highest Allied command or deploy a secret weapon, risking court-martial. Ultimately, he chose to unleash the powerful acid in his ammunition depot. A choice that would profoundly alter the battle's outcome and the very character of warfare. The German forces were under strict orders to load the shells marked with the designation, VT, signifying variable time. Concealed within each of these projectiles was a remarkable innovation that German intelligence had deemed unfeasible. A miniature, self-contained radar system, compact enough to fit inside a coffee can, yet rugged enough to withstand the rigors of being fired from a cannon. This device had the potential to amplify the lethality of artillery by an astounding 50-fold, rewriting the very mathematics of death in the frozen Ardennes forests. To fully grasp the sheer improbability of what the German soldiers were about to confront, one must first understand the age-old challenge that had long plagued artillery. A standard artillery shell's effectiveness was inherently limited by its inability to precisely time the detonation upon impact with the target. The potency of a shell relies heavily on the precise timing of its detonation. The prevalent ground-burst shell squanders much of its explosive force carving a futile crater in the soil, with its shrapnel largely absorbed and flying harmlessly skyward. To inflict maximum damage on exposed troops or those in defensive positions, an airburst is essential. This requires the shell to explode overhead, raining down its lethal fragments in a deadly cone. For ages, the sole means of achieving this was through a time fuse, a sophisticated clockwork-like mechanism at the shell's tip that required manual. The Allies sought a more reliable artillery solution, as time-fused shells proved an imperfect science. Precise calculations of the projectile's flight time, wind speed, air pressure, and the gunner's accuracy were essential, yet even minor errors could result in catastrophic failures. At best, only 1 in 5 time-fused shells detonated effectively. A new approach was required, a shell that could independently navigate and detonate with greater precision. The quest to equip artillery shells with autonomous targeting capabilities was a formidable challenge. Tasked with this endeavor was a team of civilian scientists, spearheaded by the visionary physicist Merle Tuve, at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Remarkably, this laboratory was cleverly concealed within a repurposed used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, ensuring the utmost secrecy. At the height of this project, it employed a staggering 3% of all physicists in the United States, yet none were permitted to disclose the nature of their work to their loved ones. Their mission, which seemed plucked from the pages of a Buck Rogers comic, was to construct a fully functional radar system, The device, once as bulky as a refrigerator and housing delicate glass vacuum tubes, has been miniaturized to the size of a milk bottle. Remarkably, it can withstand the immense forces encountered during the most violent conventional warfare scenarios. When fired from an artillery gun, the shell experiences an unimaginable acceleration of 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity. This means a 1 lb object would momentarily weigh 10 tons, and a human body would be crushed into a microscopic smear. Additionally, the shell spins at an astonishing rate of 25,000 revolutions per minute. The Colonel's Forbidden Order radio transmitter and receiver faced an immense challenge. Hurtling through the gun barrel at tremendous speeds, it endured searing heat and sub-zero temperatures at the peak of its trajectory, all while subjected to massive centrifugal forces that threatened to tear it apart. The task was to construct a device with fragile glass vacuum tubes that could not only withstand this ordeal, but also switch on and function flawlessly in the fleeting moments after being fired. Initial attempts proved disastrous, as prototypes were reduced to tangled wires and shattered glass upon recovery. The vacuum tubes, the very core of the system, were particularly vulnerable. The fragility of the radio components, unfit for the harsh conditions within the artillery, posed a significant challenge. The project appeared destined for failure, but the team, driven by the urgency of the war effort, refused to concede defeat. Ingenious solutions emerged, such as cushioning the components in rubber and wax, and redesigning the internal structures of the tubes to resemble suspension bridges, providing support for the delicate filaments. One physicist, James Van Allen, who would later gain renown for his discovery of the Earth's radiation belts, developed a remarkably robust vacuum tube, compact and resilient, akin to a pencil eraser. This breakthrough paved the way for further advancements. The challenge of powering a radio-equipped device with limited space for a battery was a formidable one. The ingenious solution lay in the use of a glass ampule containing the battery's electrolyte. Upon the shell's firing, the immense G-force would instantly shatter the ampule, releasing the electrolyte and activating the battery, providing power for the device's brief flight. This system leveraged the Doppler effect, with the tiny radio transmitter in the fuse emitting a continuous wave that would bounce off the ground or any objects below as the shell approached its target. The fuse's receiver was engineered to detect shifts in the frequency of the returning reflected wave. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined strength, calibrated to correspond to the ideal burst height of around 30 to 50 feet, it would trigger an electronic switch detonating the shell. This self-contained, self-powered intelligent weapon represented a billion-dollar gamble, second only in cost to the atomic bomb, poised to deliver a spectacularly terrifying payoff. Back in the Ardennes, Colonel Axelson's unauthorized decision had an immediate and utterly apocalyptic effect on the advancing Germans of the 326th Volk. The Grenadier Division's advance was abruptly halted, with formations that had been confidently moving forward just moments earlier vanishing from the battlefield entirely. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. These seasoned veterans understood the logic of combat, but what they witnessed defied all logic. Dispatches rushing back to German command were rife with disbelief and terror, describing artillery that appeared to anticipate their movements with a level of lethality they had never before encountered. News of the events at Monschau raced up the American chain of command like a lit fuse. Colonel Axelson was. The Battle of the Bastogne was a pivotal moment in the war, and one officer's daring decision to defy orders proved crucial to the outcome. Axelson, a Navy officer, had been strictly forbidden from using a powerful new anti-aircraft weapon over land, as it could fall into enemy hands and compromise Allied air superiority. Yet, faced with a major German assault, Axelson took a calculated risk, unleashing this technological marvel to halt the enemy's advance and save a vital section of the American defensive line. Now, the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, found himself grappling with a difficult decision as the Battle of the Bulge raged on. The American forces were in a dire predicament, reeling along the 85-meter front. On December 19, General Eisenhower made a critical decision. He formally requested authorization to deploy the revolutionary proximity fuses across the entire front. By December 21, the order was given, and all restrictions were lifted. This unleashed a remarkable display of American logistical prowess. Within days, trucks raced across the frozen roads of France and Belgium, delivering crates of the precious shells to the hard-pressed artillery units, including the 969th African American Artillery Battalion. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion with their mobile M7 Priest howitzers received their shipment at 1358. Crucially, the surrounded and outnumbered 101st Airborne Division clinging desperately to the vital crossroads town of Bastogne received an airdropped supply at 1410. The Siege of Bastogne is one of the most legendary chapters of the Second World War. The 101st Airborne, completely cut off and surrounded by overwhelming German forces, famously refused a surrender demand with the iconic one-word reply, "Nuts." However, their bravado masked a desperate situation, as they were running low on essential supplies. The American forces had a formidable weapon at their disposal: the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and their 75mm pack howitzers. Equipped with the cutting-edge proximity-fused shells, they were poised to confront the German strategy of relentless, massive infantry assaults. As the German formations advanced across the snow-covered fields surrounding Bastogne, the American artillery unleashed a devastating barrage. Rather than random craters in the snow, the air above the German ranks was transformed into a lethal canopy of steel. The proximity fuses, requiring no precise aiming or calculation, turned the artillery into a highly effective deterrent against the German onslaught. The Sauer River Massacre. Patton's devastating 702 casualties. The sky transformed into a killing zone that day. An entire platoon was wiped out in a single, devastating salvo. The shells detonated at their precise 30-foot height, raining down shrapnel with mathematical precision. There was no escape. Hitting the ground only made one a more stationary target for the next volley. The psychological impact was profound. German prisoners captured during the siege were often incoherent, rambling about invisible explosions and a sky that rained death. They reported that their units would lose all cohesion before even reaching the American lines, with soldiers breaking and running from the incomprehensible slaughter. Despite being surrounded, the defenders of Bastogne refused to surrender. The German forces had attained a decisive technological edge, granting them an unassailable advantage. The encirclement of the town was no mere line on a map, but a 360-degree firing range for their most advanced battlefield weaponry. As Bastogne braced for an even more chilling demonstration of the fuse's destructive power, General George S. Patton's Third Army rushed northward to relieve the beleaguered garrison. On Christmas night 1944, near the town, American intelligence detected a German battalion attempting to cross the partially frozen Sauer River under the cover of darkness and thick fog. In ordinary circumstances, this would have been an ideal opportunity for the Germans. The American artillery lacked the ability to visually pinpoint their targets, necessitating a laborious process of trial and error firing to adjust their aim. However, the revolutionary proximity fuse eliminated this challenge, requiring only a brief moment to sense its surroundings. Patton, positioned near the front lines, meticulously documented the ensuing events in his war diary. As the German troops huddled in the frigid waters, believing themselves concealed, the American artillery unleashed a barrage. The proximity-fused projectiles hurtled through the darkened skies, not needing to strike the riverbank directly. Instead, the fuse's miniature radar systems detected the water's surface and the soldiers below as the shells passed overhead. The pitch-black fog shrouded the river crossing, transforming it into a charnel house as the shells burst perfectly above the trapped men, showering them with fragments. Caught between the river and the relentless, intelligent fire, they had nowhere to flee. When the sun finally rose after the barrage ceased, American patrols surveyed the grim scene. Patton's account noted that 702 bodies were counted, an entire German battalion of nearly 8,000 men, annihilated in a matter of minutes. This was no battle, but a wholesale extermination. News of the Sauer River slaughter quickly spread through the German ranks like wildfire. The Ardennes forest's deadly transformation. How a technological breakthrough turned a strategic advantage into a lethal trap. Soldiers began refusing orders to conduct similar river crossings, as the devastating impact of the proximity fuse was shattering their morale. This revolutionary weapon was not just killing troops, but crushing their will to fight. The Germans had counted on the dense, forested terrain of the Ardennes as a tactical advantage, providing excellent cover from air attacks and concealing troop movements. However, the arrival of the proximity fuse turned the forest, their greatest asset, into their deadliest trap. In open country, the air burst from a proximity-fused shell was devastating enough. But in the dense Ardennes forest, the effect was multiplied exponentially. When a 155 mm proximity-fused shell detonated above the canopy, the shrapnel rained down with devastating force, cutting through the thick foliage and decimating any soldiers caught in its path. The deafening explosion that erupted through the forest canopy was akin to a thunderous roar. The initial blast of steel fragments at 1948 would have been lethal on its own. Yet, the secondary effect at 1953 proved even more devastating. The shrapnel tore through the massive, frozen branches of the ancient trees, creating thousands of secondary projectiles. Wooden splinters as long and thick as a man's arm that shot downwards and outwards at hundreds of feet per second. Every tree transformed into a potential source of mortal danger. The time-honored tactics of forest warfare, refined over centuries, were rendered instantly obsolete. Seeking shelter behind a large tree proved futile, as the shrapnel and splinters rained down from above. Digging a foxhole beneath a root system amounted to a death sentence. American artillerymen. The American forces rapidly mastered the art of employing their proximity-fused 20-36 shells, unleashing them directly into the forest canopy. A single projectile could clear an area the 20-42 size of a tennis court, creating a 360 degrees kill zone that proved 20-49 impossible to survive. German units, trained to disperse in wooded terrain to minimize 20-54 losses, found this strategy only exacerbated their vulnerability to the wide 2100 area of effect. Clustering together for mutual protection meant an entire squad 2106 could be annihilated by a single well-placed shell. There was no 2112 viable tactical solution. The forest, once a sanctuary, had now become a uniquely 2118 terrifying threat, as the very environment had been turned against them by this new 2124 American capability. The Germans' renowned intelligence services surprisingly failed to anticipate the devastating impact of the American proximity-fused artillery shells. Ironically, they had the opportunity to study this game-changing technology firsthand when their troops overran a massive U.S. ammunition depot during the initial offensive. Amidst the chaos, they discovered a trove of approximately 20,000 of these innovative shells. This should have been an intelligence triumph, allowing them to swiftly comprehend and counter the new threat. The captured fuses were promptly delivered to German technical experts, who meticulously disassembled the devices to uncover their inner workings. The German engineers were perplexed by the intricate inner workings they encountered. The 2222 miniature vacuum tubes, the complex wiring, and the ingenious battery design left them baffled. Their 2229 own scientific preconceptions blinded them to the truth. Firmly convinced that a delicate glass vacuum tube could never 2237 withstand the shock of being fired from a cannon, they dismissed the possibility outright. 2244 Consequently, they concluded that the components they observed must be an American deception, a ruse to conceal the real 2252 mechanism, which they speculated might involve magnetic or acoustic 2258 triggers. This failure to imagine the feasible stemmed from their own abandoned research. 2304 In fact, Germany had once been a pioneer. The German military had been actively developing proximity fuse technology even before the outbreak of the 2309 conflict. Prominent companies like Rheinmetall Borsig had managed to create functional prototypes as early as 1940. However, in a moment of sheer arrogance, Adolf Hitler issued a decree that effectively halted any weapons projects requiring more than 6 months to reach production. The Führer believed the war would conclude swiftly, rendering such long-term developments unnecessary. Consequently, the German proximity fuse program was abandoned. Their engineers, unable to accept that the Americans had solved the very problems they had given up on, stubbornly refused to acknowledge the evidence before them. During his post-war interrogation, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, would later admit that Germany's own advanced fuse designs were only a few months away from completion. The war's conclusion found the enemy's advanced fuse technology tantalizingly close to mass production. Yet, a combination of bureaucratic short-sightedness and intellectual arrogance had exacted a heavy toll. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the full scale of the American industrial miracle behind the fuse became evident. This was no single secret lab's achievement, but the coordinated effort of over 100 American companies. Renowned home appliance maker Crosley Corporation completely retooled its factories to assemble the complex fuses. Emerson Radio, known for family radios, pivoted to producing weapons of war. Industrial titans like RCA, General Electric, and Sylvania dedicated entire facilities. The military leadership dedicated their most skilled technicians to the endeavor. The level of quality control was unparalleled in large-scale manufacturing. Each of the 130 components within every fuse underwent meticulous individual testing. Solar joints were meticulously examined under high magnification. Random samples were routinely extracted from the production line and test fired from cannons to verify functionality. The rejection rate was staggeringly high, as any component exhibiting even the slightest imperfection was immediately discarded. The workforce responsible for this remarkable achievement was predominantly female. They endured punishing 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in heavily secured factories. Due to the project's stringent compartmentalization, they remained largely unaware of its broader context. The workers toiled away, unaware of the true nature of their covert endeavor. Shrouded in secrecy, they meticulously assembled these instruments of unprecedented destructive power, their silence enforced as they contributed to the war effort. By December 1944, American industry had reached a remarkable level of efficiency, churning out one proximity fuse every 2 seconds, around the clock. The staggering output had driven down the cost significantly. In 1942, a single fuse had cost a staggering $732, more than the average worker's annual salary. However, by the end of the war, the price had plummeted to just $18 per unit. Over the course of this remarkable transformation, the proximity fuse had become a decisive weapon in the battles that followed. The United States industrial might during the war was staggering. A staggering 22 million proximity fuses were produced, with 200,000 of them fired in the Battle of the Bulge alone, a testament to the formidable capabilities that Germany had severely underestimated. General George S. Patton understood the tactical advantages of this revolutionary weapon better than anyone. As his Third Army pushed northward, he relied heavily on the proximity fuse as a key breakthrough tool. Brigadier General Edward Williams, Patton's artillery commander, discarded conventional tactics and developed innovative new methods to maximize the fuse's effectiveness. He pioneered a technique called time on target, where multiple artillery battalions miles apart would coordinate their fire with mathematical precision. The Third Army's artillery units employed a coordinated barrage technique, synchronizing their fire to ensure all shells struck the target simultaneously. 28-26 This devastating tactic, where numerous proximity-detonated projectiles exploded as one over the enemy position, was a terrifying experience for the Germans. Patton's forces unleashed over 50,000 such shells between December 22 and 29, 28-35, blasting open a path through the German lines to relieve the embattled defenders of Bastogne. In Patton's own words, the effect was nothing short of remarkable. The decisive fuse proved instrumental in the Allies' triumph during the pivotal Battle of the Bulge. A striking example of the fuse's impact unfolded on Elsenborn Ridge, a critical high ground on the northern edge of the Bulge. Here, two American infantry divisions, the 2nd and the 99th, were entrenched against the elite German forces, including the formidable 6th SS Panzer Army and Hitler's personal bodyguard division, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leondarda Adolf Hitler. For 3 grueling days from December 17 to the 19th, the SS launched relentless, fanatical assaults up the steep, forested slopes. The American artillery response was overwhelming. During this 72-hour period, the American forces unleashed a barrage of unprecedented intensity, hurling a staggering 160,000 artillery rounds. Of these, approximately 40,000, or a quarter of the total, were equipped with proximity fuses. Subsequent analysis revealed a startling statistic. These proximity-fused shells, comprising just 25% of the total, were responsible for an estimated 60% of the 5,000 German casualties on the ridge. The numbers spoke for themselves. In this particular engagement, the innovative fuse had quadrupled the lethality of the American artillery. The elite Waffen-SS troops, indoctrinated with a belief in their own invincibility, were shattered by this devastating display of firepower. They charged up the hills, only to be met by a wall of air-bursting steel and wood splinters, with entire companies vanishing in the blink of an eye. This technological breakthrough would go on to shape the future of modern smart weapons, forever altering the face of warfare. The harrowing accounts of survivors described the grim necessity of scaling mounds of fallen comrades to press on with the assault. After 3 days of this horrific carnage, the attacks finally ceased. Germany's finest soldiers had been shattered, not by superior numbers or tactical brilliance, but by a technological advantage they could not overcome. The fuse's decisive contribution to the battle came on New Year's Day 1945, when the German Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise strike by 900 fighter planes against Allied airfields. The attack achieved complete surprise, destroying hundreds of Allied aircraft on the ground. Yet as the German pilots turned to retreat, the triumphant aerial assault swiftly transformed into a harrowing ordeal. The pilots encountered an unprecedented barrage of anti-aircraft fire, unlike anything they had experienced before. The ingenious proximity fuse, originally designed for this very purpose, was now deployed in vast numbers. These fuses did not require a direct hit. They merely needed to approach the target closely. As a German fighter streaked by, the shell's radar would detect it and detonate, unleashing a devastating cloud of shrapnel directly in its path. Pilots accustomed to evading conventional anti-aircraft fire found themselves powerless against this new threat. The shells seemed to anticipate and counter their evasive tactics. Of the 207 German planes lost that day, a staggering 172 were shot down by this formidable defense. The American forces unleashed a devastating barrage of anti-aircraft guns, with the majority employing proximity fuses. This crippling assault proved too much for the already weakened Luftwaffe, which never recovered from the staggering losses incurred that fateful day. By early January 1945, the secret could no longer be contained, as the sheer volume of shells fired and the eyewitness accounts of their remarkable effects made it impossible to conceal. The War Department eventually authorized a limited public disclosure, leading to vague media reports about a new, transformative artillery shell that was amplifying the potency of American guns. However, this revelation came too late for German intelligence to mount any effective countermeasures. A captured German report from January 10 grimly acknowledged, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery." The proximity fuse proved to be a game-changer in the Ardennes offensive, inflicting severe casualties on German forces. Despite Hitler's final push, the war in Europe was nearing its end. The Battle of the Bulge officially concluded on January 25, 1945, costing Germany dearly in terms of manpower and resources. In the aftermath, German commanders unanimously acknowledged the decisive impact of the proximity fuse, with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt describing it as artillery that seemed to have eyes. The proximity fuse, a revolutionary artillery shell detonator, was instrumental in the Allies' defense against the German Ardennes offensive. Activated at the optimal 32-33 height, this weapon caused substantial 32-39 casualties among German troops. Despite the ongoing conflict, the war in Europe was drawing to a close, with the Battle of the Bulge officially ending on January 25, 1945. The offensive had exacted a heavy toll on Germany, resulting in 100,000 casualties and depleting its remaining 33,004 personnel and equipment. In post-war interrogations, German military leaders, including Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, unanimously acknowledged the decisive impact of the proximity fuse, with von Rundstedt describing it as artillery that seemed to have 33-20 eyes. The American artillery struck fear into the hearts of enemy soldiers, particularly the novel aerial detonating shells that sowed panic even among seasoned troops, as one witness attested. The humble proximity fuse's legacy extends far beyond the battlefields of the Second World War. The scientific and engineering breakthroughs required to create this device laid the groundwork for the entire modern electronics industry. The rugged miniaturized vacuum tubes that powered the fuse were the direct precursors to the transistor. Moreover, the rigorous quality control methods pioneered in the fuse factories became the global benchmark for manufacturing. Dr. James Van Allen, the engineer behind the tough little vacuum tubes, would later apply those same principles to build instruments. The initial American satellites, which uncovered the radiation belts now associated with his name, marked a significant milestone. However, the core concept of the proximity fuse, a weapon equipped with a sensor capable of perceiving its environment and making decisions, was the true birth of smart weaponry. Every guided missile, smart bomb, and autonomous drone on today's battlefields can trace their origins to the fundamental principle first demonstrated in the frozen Ardennes forests. The revolution sparked by Colonel Axelson's initial unauthorized order continues to reverberate to this day. The German soldiers who perished under that peculiar intelligent artillery were not merely casualties of a battle, but the first victims of this technological transformation. The dawn of a revolutionary era in military affairs had arrived. Victory was no longer solely a matter of bravery or strategic acumen, but increasingly hinged upon the unyielding and unsettling rationality of advanced scientific capabilities. This was the defining hallmark of a transformative period in the conduct of warfare.